Okay. Hello, World History Honors. It is April 2nd, and we are going to do another quick review session here. And this is, I believe, what we left off with before our extended surprise spring break, and we had done the causes of World War I. Now, I'm sure a lot of you kind of remember that we were working on an assignment, a writing assignment, and a document analysis assignment where you were going through and looking through those main causes of World War One. And so I'm just going to add a note here that my kind of initial thought with that particular assignment is to just kind of uh, because so many of you were at different places with that assignment. Some people turned it in, some people took it home. It was a hard copy instead of an online assignment. I'll probably give everybody a little type of extra credit because we had all worked on it kind of diligently. I could talk, I promise. But I'm not going to expect to collect it. But I do want to reward all of you for working on that particular assignment. And that's my initial thought about that particular hard copy assignment. And then I don't think I will give you an additional assignment today, and we'll just have this review piece about the main causes of World War One. So that is what I'm thinking for today, and that will get us to kind of the end of the review week as we start back into our semester. So the causes of World War One, and we have this acronym now, kind of depending on where you look. And if you remember that assignment, we were working with this one, the MAIN, as like the four main causes of World War One. And then depending on your kind of perspective, you could throw assassination in there. To break it down, that MAIN are like the long-term trends that have been going on for several decades before 1914 that caused World War One, and then you have the immediate effect of assassination that sparks and is the trigger event for the actual event and beginning of World War One. So let's review those, and then we will talk about assassination again at the end and kind of go through that one event that triggered World War One itself. So, right, that first one is this idea of militarism. And militarism, or a militaristic society, is one in which you intertwine like the glorification of the military, and that idea permeates throughout society at both the highest level of powers in the government, all the way through like a militaristic pride and glory amongst common people in the society itself. Along with that is like the glory of war, and this cultural idea that it is glorious and honorable, and in kind of a, maybe we would think sick way today, glorious way to die and to give your life for your country. So a militaristic society is one in which you glorify and praise war, military, glory, and those types of things. As an official policy leading up to World War One, what we saw right before the beginning of World War One in a militaristic culture and a militaristic society is massive growth by European powers in spending towards military expenditures. So we have this word defense here, and defense is a kind of current euphemism for military. So today we have the Secretary of Defense in the executive branch of the government. That used to be called the Secretary of War. But to try to lessen the gravity of the word war, we've kind of seen that switch over to defense. So that's what this is in reference to here when we talk about defense. And as you can see, leading up to World War One, the major nations that are going to be responsible for the majority of the fighting and the beginning of World War One had continued to spend and invest resources in their militaries. with the idea being here that like if you are going to invest and grow your military power, the kind of natural outgrowth of that is some type of war and conflict itself. You're not going to build large militaries and not use them. And so you see this militaristic spending immediately before World War I, and then that kind of glory of military in the culture itself. I'm actually going to switch here, so I was kind of trying to look for an example. And I think this kind of does an example of like of how a militaristic society glorifies and permeates through culture. And one kind of quick example is I think this does a good example of like masculinity, so amongst kind of common people, that you tie in, if you live in a militaristic society, that gendered idea of military, soldier, hero, and then that is kind of the cultural message you put towards your young men, right? So you have this kind of ruggedly handsome soldier here, and then this young woman here who saying, your motherland will never forget you. Kind of this beautiful scene of masculinity and femininity wrapped up in a militaristic idea. You can see that kind of right here. Our second cause was the alliance system, right? And this idea that right before World War I, the major powers of Europe had essentially formed two teams, right? And so an alliance is that formal agreement or treaty between two or more nations so that they cooperate for specific purposes. And if you remember the examples that we had before we started our spring break, we had a couple examples of how you had several nations agree that if I go to war, then you will go to war. And so the alliance system, let's look at this map first. The alliance system looks like this right before World War I. And so you have Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy. That's one alliance on one side. And then Britain, France, Russia on another. And we'll get to this in a second, but this Serbia here, this is going to be the crux and the beginning of World War I. But you have these two teams. And then the Ottomans, they're not part of this alliance here, but the Ottomans will join World War I on the side of the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. But we will get into that a little later. But these are our two teams, right? And the idea is that if Austria-Hungary goes to war, which, spoiler alert, they will, well, then Germany will go to war, right? Or if France goes to war, so will Britain, so will Russia. And so what you create here is a situation where instead of wars or conflict breaking out between, these two nations, if there's a conflict between here, Austria-Hungary and Russia, instead of an isolated war, it becomes a continental war. And this is kind of the situation that we see right before World War I begins. And I mentioned, just to try to tie in and connect this to what's going on in the modern day, I would just try to make you aware of this idea that the United States is part of an alliance system called NATO, where it's the United States and a lot of Western Europe under something called like Article 5 of the NATO alliance agreements. And there's no concern or anything I'm trying to mention here, but I just thought it'd be interesting for you to be aware that it's not like alliance systems disappeared 100 years ago. The United States is part of a robust international alliance system to this day. So this graphic just shows this kind of deep interconnected link system between the two sides. Here you have one team, here you have the other team, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance on this side, and how a small conflict on the Balkan Peninsula in Serbia brings in all of these nations when conflict breaks out in 1914. Okay. Our third is a concept that we've been covering now for several weeks, but it's that imperial system, right? And so I mentioned in my review yesterday that idea that 5/6 of the planet is controlled by foreign powers, specifically the very Europeans that also have these interconnected alliance systems, right? All these nations here are not just isolated in Europe, but they maintain gigantic empires all across the globe. And so when we talk about a world conflict, remember that when those European powers on the European continent go to war with one another, they then, of course, drag in their respective imperial holdings all around the globe, right? So this is what Africa looks like right before World War I. The vast majority of Africa is not independent. It is controlled by the French and the British and the Germans and the Belgians. And so when Europe goes to war, so do all of these nations. And this is how you get, because of imperialism, instead of a European conflict, you get a world conflict, because those Europeans control 5/6 of the planet. And then nationalism. That's our last one, right? And nationalism, we did a whole nationalism activity several weeks ago. But in terms of nationalism as a driving factor, I guess I would highlight two things here. And one is nationalism as tied to imperialism, with the idea being that if you have intense devotion and loyalty to one's nation, that helps drive imperialism by creating competition between different imperial powers. Or this idea that, well, if Britain controls this part of Africa, well then if I'm in Germany, I want to control this part of Africa. And I never want to fall behind those nations that I'm competing against, because I want to glorify and increase the power of my own nation at the expense and the humiliation of others. You can also tie nationalism into militarism, or the idea that, like, if I have 100,000 soldiers in Britain, well, then Germany's going to have 200,000 soldiers. Well, if they have 200,000, then Britain's going to have 1,000,000 soldiers. And in this way, nationalism and that competition amongst nations continues to drive that competitiveness between the European powers right before World War I. And in a sad way, perhaps, nationalism creates the parameters in which, instead of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people fighting and dying in World War I, we see millions of people fighting and dying before World War I because of the nationalistic competition right before the conflict itself. Another kind of example of nationalism here. I'm going to go back to this little piece of propaganda and kind of write this militarism of this ruggedly handsome young man. But then remember that the woman that he is going to fight and die and glorify himself in battle for is, of course, draped in the flag of the motherland. Right? You're not just going to die and fight for this woman that you may or may not love, but you're doing it for the motherland, the country, the nation that you're from. I have another piece here from Britain, right? Are we afraid? No. And this kind of piece of propaganda is draped in the flag of the nation. We have the American eagle here in the United States of America. In Britain, they have the bulldog. I suppose you can find that kind of cute, and all these imperial holdings, defending the borders of the motherland and the nation. Okay. So that's the quick review of those four nations. And then tying back to nationalism, right, that process had been going on throughout the 1800s, and we discussed how nationalism is a unifying factor to unify Germany as a single nation instead of many different separate kingdoms, or Italy instead of separate different kingdoms, uniting that nation because of a united culture and language and religion and all these things. And some parts of Europe had not been united independent nations, but still sought to be. And so when we talk about assassination, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, right, that problem comes from this idea in here, right? So here's the Balkan Peninsula in Europe, and you have Serbia here, right? In Serbia, built from Serbs, but in this part here, and specifically if you can see Sarajevo, let me open this up for you. Right, so there's lots of Serbs living here in Serbia, but here in Sarajevo, there are lots of ethnic Serbs that are separated from Serbia, but because of nationalistic feelings, right, the Serbs here want to be part of Serbia. However, right before World War I, this part of the Balkan Peninsula was controlled by Austria-Hungary, right? And so that conflict, that assassination that we covered right before you went on spring break, was this idea that Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was visiting Sarajevo. He was visiting that part of the Balkan Peninsula that had lots of Serbs, and because of nationalistic feelings wanted to become part of Serbia, but were still under the thumb of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so you had that group, the Black Hand, which sought to assassinate him, and they did, and they were successful. And when the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary was assassinated, Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. Well, the problem is that Russia was protecting Serbia and had promised to protect the Serbs. And so when Austria-Hungary, right, declares war on Serbia, well, Russia's protecting Serbia. So Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary. Well, because of the alliance system, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Germany declares war on Russia, Britain and France declare war on Germany, and the next thing you know, you have this conflict in Serbia that drags in all of these powers, and of course, the empires, 5/6 of the globe that is controlled by these particular empires, and you have the beginning of World War I. Okay, so that is my review of the causes of World War I. I hope you remember most of that. And that is your lesson for April 2nd, with the idea that we will start and get more into World War I next week. For those of you looking for something to read, I have a book here that I would recommend. It is about World War I, but it takes the perspective really from both people in power, but then also the common person experience, which I found really interesting. This book does a really good job of showing how those causes of militarism, the alliance system, imperialism, and nationalism, how those big historical ideas influence kind of common people and help convince them that going to war is a good idea, at least in the beginning. And then it deals with, after World War I, the tragic consequences for those people who got carried away by those historical ideas that we just covered. So if you need something to read, I remember this book being excellent. I have it sitting here next to me, and I'm very tempted to read it again. I hope you're all doing well, and I hope to talk to many of you soon.